It's nice to be back in Chicago. We come here on occasion, as Pat Ryan pointed out, to work with Habitat and building homes, but our primary purpose in coming to Chicago is to visit our son and our grandchildren who live in this neighborhood. So grandparents would understand very clearly why we're so delighted to come back to Chicago tonight. The Carter Center, to which President Ryan referred, is an entity that has a wide range of responsibilities, dealing with human rights, holding elections in this hemisphere to end conflicts and to bring about peace and democracy and freedom, working in the Middle East on a long-term program for peace and stability, monitoring what goes on in the Soviet Union, dealing in the alleviation of hunger. Tonight, however, I've been asked to talk about some concerns on a specific subject of conflict and peace. And then following that, I'll make a few remarks regarding the Gulf War and save some time at the end for your questions. I try to think of a story to illustrate the point I want to make throughout my talk, and that is that in dealing with war and how to alleviate it and how to maintain peace as an alternative to war, it not only requires a powerful nation with massive military forces and strong diplomatic efforts, but also innovation, new ideas, new concepts that really are an integral part of the life of the entrepreneurship that has made our nation so great. I'm going to take one story to illustrate it very quickly, and that is about a young man in a business school who was always thinking of new ways to do things. He was so innovative that he aggravated his professors profoundly. And they were so aggravated that they threatened to fail him because when they would ask a simple question, he gave a complicated answer. As a college professor myself now for 9 years, I know how bad that can be. But in a simple physics exam, the professor asked, how do you measure the height of a building? By using a barometer. And the young man's answer said, there are at least 5 or 6 different ways. I don't know which one you want. So the professor said, okay, I'm going to fail you because I'm tired of your smart aleck answers. So he called the young man in to give him a final opportunity, and the young man said, well, my answer was absolutely correct. And the man said, there's only one way to measure the height of a building. And the young man said, I can tell 4 or 5 ways. And the professor said, okay, you tell me, and I'll give you a passing grade. The young man said, first, I can measure the pressure at the bottom of the building, atmospheric pressure. I can go to the top of the building and get the difference and compute the height of the building. The professor said, yes, that's right, that's it. The young man said, there's a lot of more ways too. He said, I can take the barometer, stand it on the ground, measure the height of it, the length of the shadow, measure the length of the shadow of the building, and I can determine the height of the building. And the professor was a little more disturbed, and he said, okay, that's 2 ways. The young man said, third, I can get a string, tie it to the barometer, go to the top of the building, lower it to the ground, measure the length of the string. That's the height of the building. That's 3. He said, another way is I can take a stopwatch, go to the top of the building, drop the barometer, see how long it takes to hit the ground, and I can compute the height of the building. And the guy said, well, I'm still not going to give you a good grade because that's still not enough answers. By that time, the provost walked by, who happened to be in the business school, and he said, if you can give the provost an answer, I'll give you 100 on your test. The provost came in. The young man said, well, I've got a lot of more ways. He said, well, tell me one concerning the business school. He said, okay, I'll take my barometer, go over to the superintendent of buildings, and I'll say, this is a very nice barometer. It's worth a good bit of money. You tell me how high the building is, I'll give you my barometer. Well, the point is, in dealing with war and peace, sometimes the most vital 2 elements in the life of a nation and a society, we need to be innovative in searching for ways to find a better quality of life for us and for others. Tonight, in preparing for this talk, I look back on kind of the history of wars about which I've been familiar. And I'll just give you a brief summary of those. In World War I wasn't born there, but my father was the first lieutenant in World War I. After that, it was known as a war to end all wars. It didn't do it. World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all those were looked upon with great satisfaction when we won. Not always did we win, but a sense of revulsion by the people of our country and the world when the war was over, and a determination that we would avoid future wars. That has not been the case. Advocates for peace have not been very successful. So far, Saddam Hussein indicates no willingness to withdraw. But as the forces of war continue to be marshaled against him, as his forces are both decimated and also forced to retreat, we have to be prepared for a possibility of negotiation to deal with the ultimate leadership of Iraq, either Saddam or one of his successors, as soon as he decides and announces his willingness to withdraw from Kuwait. This war is a special case for us now. We're all preoccupied with it. We don't want to talk about much else. But in the future, the new world order brought about by a cessation of the long-existing Cold War between us and the Soviet Union must include the prevention of further major conflicts and the resolution through peace negotiations of those that do exist. A measure of the greatness of a nation, including ours, is how strong a force for peace we can be. Now our duty, charged to us by the world community of nations, is to force a restoration of the independence of Kuwait. All Americans support that commitment. We hope and pray that our forces will be successful soon and that losses on our side will be minimal. Following that, however, it's the duty of leaders and citizens of our country to marshal again the reputation that our country is not only a force for the preservation of international borders and strengthening the international law as we're doing now, but we are indeed a force for the preservation of peace. Thank you very much.
During your tenure, you established the framework for a national energy policy. It would appear that the U.S. has abandoned this policy, and we have once more become highly dependent on imported oil. What changes should be considered to deal with the problem of our dependency on foreign oil?
The day I was inaugurated president, we were importing about 48% of our oil from foreign sources. I worked for 4 years, almost ad nauseum, trying to get a comprehensive energy policy for our country in a multiplicity of ways, emphasizing, first of all, conservation. We passed laws that required automobiles year by year to be increasingly efficient, and we increased the efficiency of our average fleet of automobiles from just 12 miles per gallon then, ultimately to the new fleets being required to have an efficiency of 28 miles per gallon. We mandated by law the insulation of homes, new homes built, and changed the structure for charging people for electricity use to discourage rather than to encourage excessive uses of electricity. In addition, we promoted increased exploration from oil in our country and the use of solar energy and other alternative sources. That's the basic principle, that is the basic principle on which I think our future energy policies should be predicated. Over a few years, when these laws went into effect, and many of them are still in effect but not rigidly enforced, we cut from 48% down to about 30% of our oil being imported. Now, in this past year, we passed the 50% mark. We are now importing a greater percentage of our energy than ever before in history. So I believe that it has to be a very broad-ranging and multiple program, but the primary emphasis ought to be on conservation, not continued waste, with the hope of developing new sources of energy in our country. I'm particularly opposed, for instance, to the development of the Alaska Wildlife Region on the northern coast of Alaska that Rosa and I visited last year. I think that saving energy by increased efficiency of automobiles, the use of electricity is a much better way. And this has to be done in concert with other countries. It's hard for Americans to realize how much energy we do waste. For a given level of productivity, for instance, the United States uses 2.5 times as much oil as does Japan. We use twice as much oil for a given level of GNP as does Germany. This is part of the concept that we have now in the United States that it's okay to waste energy, but primarily conservation, alternative sources of fuel, increased production and exploration in our country, and mandatory efficiency requirements in the U.S. law.
What was the single most satisfying aspect of your presidency, and how do you feel it will be remembered?
Well, I think that two things that historians now mention after 12 years or so that I've been out of office is the peace efforts that we mounted. Whenever there was a troubled place in the world, I marshaled all the resources I could possibly gather from our greatest of all nations to negotiate, to mediate, to try to bring about a resolution of the problem peacefully. And the other thing we did was try to be the champion of human rights. I made my mistakes. Some of the things that we attempted were not successful. But I think as the years go by, the fact that the United States, at least for that time, was a champion of peace and human rights are the things that make me most proud. And I hope that in the future, if I am remembered by historians, it would be for those two characteristics. Thank you very much.